So today afternoon, we're joined by a well-known Kenyan academic and an expert on politics and governance, Dr. Peter Kagwanja, who is also a founder of the Africa Policy Institute. We're very happy to have you at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, we're going to talk about the Kenyan election. You know, there's a lot of media focus on the elections, and we just, would like to know what makes this upcoming election so critical? Why is it so important? Why should we pay attention to it?
I think we should pay attention to this election because of the possibility of violence. Possibility because since 1991, when Kenya returned to multi-party democracy, elections have been plagued by cycles of violence. And even when there is not much violence at the national level, as the case was in 2002 and 2013. Local violence takes place within counties and wards, and taking a heavy toll as it does at the national level. So it is important to focus on this election to ensure that the 2017 polls are peaceful and transparent, and therefore to help entrench democracy in Kenya. As you know, Kenya is a very critical state in the Horn of Africa region, has been widely embraced as a pivotal anchor state in matters peace and security. It is also a regional economic hub, currently the fourth largest economy in Africa, growing at an annual rate of 5.5%. It is also looked at in the future as one of the major partners of major players, and a really pad for companies both in the West and the East that are investing on the continent. It's essentially the gateway to the eastern part of the Indian Ocean. And finally, the country is a very, very important strategic partner to America and the West in the war against violent extremism and terrorism in Africa generally, but more specifically in the Horn of Africa. It has also been involved in conflict resolution and mediation in countries like Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, and Burundi. And therefore, it is important that Kenya remains stable, that it continue to be a critical partner to the United States moving forward into the 21st century.
Right. Now, you talk about conflict, the cycles of conflict that were there in previous elections, such as the election in 2007. What factors will need to be in place to ensure that this doesn't happen again?
The approaches to conflict in Kenya by the country's external partners have largely focused on the short-term intervention, basically very reactive rather than long-term. Our suggestion in our discussion today was that we begin to look at Kenya as a country that has been going through almost 3 decades of low-intensity conflict, which tend to escalate during elections, but it is always there in the background. Therefore, measures taken must not only address conflict, the root causes of conflict for 2017, but also look at 2022 as another area when we might get another similar cycle of conflict. And measures here would basically include talking to the main players, the 2 political formations that are there, to basically commit themselves to conduct themselves and the election in a peaceful manner, commit themselves to a non-violent approach to any dispute that might arise from the conflict. Most of the issues, the so-called root causes of violence in Kenya, were addressed largely as part of the mediation of the 2008 conflict. And they were all captured in a capsule in the new constitution, which addressed issues of sharing of resources, sharing of power from the top to the bottom, and all that was captured in the devolution system. But what we observed in the discussion was that devolution itself has come up with new challenges to stability and violence in the coming election. And therefore, arguably, we have not only devolved power and resources, but we have, also devolved the burdens of national government, particularly the propensity to conflict during elections. And the argument was made convincingly that whereas the 2017 election may not be as intense as it was in 2007 at the presidential level, we have a new frontier of violence in the counties and at the wards, mainly because of the new stakes that have gone up as a result of these jobs, almost 1,800 of them paying so well that the competitions are high, and the rivalry between those who are holding office and those who want to get them out of offices, it becomes intense. And therefore, addressing these issues is going to be critical. We've got to shift the focus, not only from the presidential election to the primary, not only from the presidential to the county elections, but to begin to look at what the primaries have meant for the coming election in terms of what we've seen in the counties happening, whether it's going to intensify as we get closer to the real election, on August 8th. 2017.
Now, Dr. Kagwanja, I wonder if you could say something about ethnic mobilization, because this has been a key feature of Kenyan elections in the past. If we look at what happened in 2007, but even in earlier election cycles, what might be done to ensure that this problem does not surface again this time around?
I think the ethnicity in Kenya must be conceived for what it is. First, what we are talking about is political tribalism, meaning mobilization of politics along ethnic lines and playing on ethnic fault lines to create communities of grievances, which become like war formations and basically tend to almost inevitably lead to conflict at different degrees. What we have not talked about, and we don't normally talk about, is moral ethnicity, which is basically the benefits that come from belonging to an ethnic group. The welfare role played by these identities in terms of helping members in hours of need, particularly in countries where 40% of the population is living below poverty line. It becomes a very good instrument for mobilization. But it is not that mobilization to basically pull people out of poverty and address their own, address the shortcomings of the economies. But it is the use and misuse of people and voters by the power elite in order to put them to power. And what that has happened from the early years, and we begin to see that the Kenyan politics is essentially a competition not of ethnic groups, but formations of multiple ethnic groups that coalesce into political parties. If you look at KANU in the 1960s and KANDO, the Kenya African Democratic Union, in the same time, these were two formations, not one ethnic group, not two, but a number of ethnic groups coalesced into these formations. The same case happened in the rise of Kenya People's Union in the late 60s. And we see the resurgence of the same formations after 1991, when multi-party came. And the divide and rule strategy by KANU in order to remain in power, basically entrench the politics of political balkanization. And that balkanization did not consolidate party formations, but basically polarized populations. And therefore, our focus should be on how do we allow political formations to get roots as instruments of democracy, as ways and means of deepening the country's young democracy, without at the same time that polarizing element of ethnic mobilization. It is very clear that politics in Kenya revolves around 5 ethnic groups, the so-called Big Five, that constitute about 70% of the voting power in the country. These are the Kikuyu, the Luhya, the Luo, the Kalenjin, and the Kamba. Between those groups, they constitute between 70 and 75% of Kenya's voting power. And therefore, the puzzles that are brought together in terms of ethnic horse trading and forming formations that fight national elections can directly tell us whether or not a certain election is going to be intensely violent or it is not. For example, the 2002 election had 2 aspects to it, which would inform why there was no violence at that time, intense violence at national level, which is basically that we had the Kalenjin and sections of the Kikuyu in one camp, and the rest of the communities, including 3/4 of the Kikuyu, on the other hand. And the 2 candidates actually came from the same ethnic group. So very quickly, the political, the identity, ethnic identity, gave way to other forms of identity, particularly generational identity. So the 2002 election did not revolve around the axis of ethnicity, but the axis of generational politics, one young and one old. The 2013 also was not violent at the national level, but was intensely violent at the regional level. In Marsabit, in Tana River, in parts of Masai land, or which basically Narok and to an extent Kajiado. This was a very violent election because of the rise of counties and the need to share power at the county level, and not only sharing power, but with the prospect of sharing resources. So that's how these formations have come up. Now, as we approach 2017, you'll notice that we have 2 formations, one predominantly Kikuyu Kalenjin, and another one which is supposed to be predominantly Luo, Kamba, and Luhya. Now, Jubilee itself is, of course, manipulating, or playing with the situation in order to win votes across the board. But the determinant factor are not going to be this Big Five. It's the lower tier of communities that constitute about 5 to 6% of population at the individual level. For example, the Meru, the Kisii, the Mijikenda at the coast, and collectively the Maasai and the Turkana and the Somalis, who form the pastoral coalition. Now, the interesting bit in this is that how these formations are going to mobilize that vote is going to determine whether the election is going to be peaceful or not. If there's intense use of negative rhetoric, playing with wedge issues, in other words, the fault line issues that generate grievances, then we are likely to see a very volatile kind of electoral season. But it is important for both Kenya, the government, the opposition, and the international community to do everything possible to ensure that Kenya does not hurtle down to another 2007 and 2008.
Now, Kenya is very well known for developing indigenous early warning systems during moments of crisis. How well are these systems working right now in the context of the election, and how resilient will they be in preventing election-related violence?
One thing is clear, that the coalition that is ruling, I hazard to say that it's not what you would call your kind of a coalition that is based on like-minded and friends and or that camaraderie kind of arrangement. I like seeing it as a truce between two groups that basically fought in 2007, 2008. And therefore, Jubilee, in a sense, is a conflict resolution framework. Just as the Constitution, the new Constitution was crafted as a framework to address the spectrum of grievances that emerged in 2008 and stoked the violence that we saw. And therefore, the good thing is that Jubilee seems to be holding together as a coalition. And that in itself is very, very critical, because it is the grievances of the Kalenjin who had been in power for 24 years and who were swept out of office by the NAC coalition. And they developed a deep sense of grievance that the new government that was elected in 2002 basically ran their people out of major jobs in the military, in the civil service, and also denied them business opportunities and locked them out of major lucrative opportunities in the government. Therefore, 2007 was an attempt for the Kalenjin in a large measure to reassert themselves in the national politics, and they came with vengeance and bitterness, and that is what you see in the kind of violence that we witness in the Rift Valley, and therefore coming together with the Kikuyus has meant that at least one problem is solved. The next thing is, how do you ensure an inclusive government after 2017? Because two communities cannot form, cannot convincingly, represent a nation where we have 43 communities or so. Therefore, Jubilee itself has been conscious of this fact, the need to be an inclusive political formation, and that has helped a lot in terms of the transformation from the Jubilee coalition to Jubilee party, which meant dissolution of about 9 ethnic-based parties into one solid party, and also inclusion of other non-Kalenjin and non-Kikuyu political organizations within that, either as a Rus coalition or affiliated in one way or another, or collapsed into one party. That has been very helpful. That analysis is very critical, because it is, you can take this to the bank, that at the presidential level, conflict is likely to be there. Dispute over results could be there if the electoral management institutions are not trusted and don't seem to be doing a credible job. But the intensity and the destructiveness of whatever form of violence might appear is going to be extremely low, because of just the ethnic alignment. The Kambas traditionally don't go to the streets. They wage their grievances using other channels, and therefore we are only left with one community which will naturally or somehow get to the streets if they feel that the election was not credibly managed. But again, that itself is easier to address, rather than when you have two communities, as we had in 2007, basically focusing on another, the Kikuyu, the famous 41 against 1, which basically stoked the kind of sentiments that divided politics during that time. So 2017 is likely to be an easier one to handle at the presidential level. I cannot say the same for the county level elections, and therefore the international community and the Kenya government and any other player seeking to prevent, the violence in Kenya should focus on the region, at the regional level, at the low level. And we have already witnessed through the primaries, which were perhaps Kenya's most violent and most chaotic ever. Reason being, occupants of those seats for the first time are paid salaries that are higher than those of senior civil servants. 300,000, which is about $30,000, plus allowances amounting to about $50,000, and other privileges, which in total would bring about $10,000 for a seat that in the past has never received any form of income. Also, when you come to the governors, we are going to almost $20,000 plus the whole package, and the senator almost the same. Women rep almost the same, and these are 1,800 positions that have emerged, and the intensity of conflict and tensions are very high, particularly in those areas which are considered party strongholds. We have this early warning information. It is how we are going to deal with it which is important, and there are very many indicators that the Kenya has the capacity to deal with this. There are indicators that the region and Kenya's international partners, the international community, are already aware of these particular possibilities. And I think that's why we held this meeting today.
Now, you talked about institutions, the Electoral Commission, the judiciary, the police. How independent are they? Certainly, what is the perception of the ordinary voter about these institutions? And is there any difference in the way in which they're perceived now and the way that they were perceived, for instance, in 2013 or 2011?
Paul, I think we really need to address this issue head on, because in today's debate, there were two views that emerged. That one, the Kenyan security is too weak to intervene effectively in case violence erupted in 2017. I made the point, based on my consultancies, my study of security dynamics in other areas beyond the conflict dynamics that we are focusing on, that for the first time since independence, Kenya has the strongest, well-equipped, and the largest security force, and also law enforcement force, giving it capacity to deal with the 2017 protests or violence, whatever form it might take, including criminal violence that if it occurs. Now, the forces, particularly the military, has traditionally been known across the world to be extremely professional and neutral, trained and socialized in very professional spaces like the American National Defense College, University, where we are today. Many of the senior officers of Kenyan military are laureates of these particular institutions in many ways. The police, on the contrary, is perceived traditionally as a very corrupt force. There are other neutral forces which, even if they wanted, they cannot get into contact with corruption because they are not reviewing the people they do. That's the General Service Unit, which is normally the one that intervenes in cases of chaos, not the regular police. The security reforms after 2010 have created a new force called the provincial. They call it. It's basically focusing on the national, administration. So it's an administration police, which is perhaps a larger contingent now. Almost the same numbers as the police, And again, these are not in contact with the civilians, where they have interactions that would enable them to be corrupt. So the focus on corruption and inefficiency and so on basically is on the regular police who are on day-to-day basis dealing with the public in traffic, in looking at crimes and so on and so forth. And again, that is also being addressed. So the capacity of a combined administration police, the general service unit, and the military is largely neutral and professional. Kenya today has the largest per capita, distribution of the security forces, a very conscious process adopted after 2013. I made the point very assertively that the country is reaping the dividends of the campaign against Al-Shabaab, because the attacks by Al-Shabaab in churches, schools, hospitals, public spaces, markets, public transport system and buses drew Kenya's attention to its own vulnerability to militias, criminal groups. In fact, during the 2013 attack on Westgate Mall in Nairobi, it is said, and I think there is truth to it, that the various segments of security forces shot at each other. Today, we have a very well coordinated and centrally, organized security process. You can already see there are street cameras to even detect people inside their vehicles. If you look at when you get into the Kenya Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, you were checked of any kind of harmful item you might be carrying, kilometers away from the airport, so that you cannot get to the vicinity of the airport with that kind of a thing. It is that kind of security alertness, that awareness, that capacity which the government can draw upon in terms of dealing with, ensuring that, protests or violence does not get in hand. In other words, we have state capacity to enforce law and order. The fundamental question is not there. The question is whether in enforcing law and order, the forces will adhere to the rule of law and operate within a human rights framework. That is what needs to be watched. And I think that's where civil society organizations and others will have to watch. Of course, the government is aware that it's under watch. Now, the other thing we can point also related to that is that 2008 violence was largely an indication that the government had lost ground to proliferation of militias, vigilantes, and criminal gangs, which were hired by politicians to basically wage war within Nairobi, its environments, and in the rural areas. Since 2014, we have seen a deliberate move by the government to reclaim its monopoly over legal instruments of violence. We are seeing the rise of an effective state that can enforce law and order within its own boundaries. The one which has minimized the role and effectiveness of vigilantes and militias that are in private hands. And therefore, that itself is a good guarantee that the violence is likely to take a very low key in 2007. And therefore, what I think should be the role of the international community in this regard is basically to get the various players to commit themselves to a peaceful kind of election, but more importantly, to build the capacity of these, to help the government build the capacity of these forces to operate within a human rights framework, because that is critical. Also, to work resolutely to root out the culture which has been described by some scholars as oligopoly of violence, basically more diffusion of violence into society that makes it very difficult to maintain law and order. That it has done, but it also need to deepen that whole process. And I think we have a very good, we're beginning to have a very good sense of the Kenyan security forces. The question was raised during debate about the increasing role of the military in internal affairs in Kenya and whether this is compromising its own tradition of professionalism. The answer is no. Whereas individual retired military officers might play a high-profile role in which might appear partisan, within the forces remain very, very neutral. Now, when they intervene locally, they are under what we call civilian, governance. They take their cue from the civilian government. And what does that mean? The minister, the principal secretary, and finance officer within the Ministry of Defense must be civilians. And therefore the military architecture falls under that. Moreover, the military cannot undertake any operation within the country without the outright and express authorization by Parliament, and which is clearly defined in terms of its duration and the focus of its operation. And therefore, again, in this particular regard, the focus will be on whether or not such interventions occur within a human rights framework. And I think the government is conscious that it needs to uphold human rights.
Right. Well, it's definitely an important country, very important issues, and these are things that we're going to continue to watch very carefully, and we'll definitely reach out and continue talking to you as we prepare for these very, very important elections. So we've been talking to Dr. Peter Kagwanja, a very well-known Kenyan scholar, founder of the Africa Policy Institute, who was very kind to spare some time to come and see us at the Africa Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.